You don't have to do all that. And they're grabbing me. Hey, you stop. You don't have to do all that.
Stop resisting.
Stop resisting.
Stop resisting.
Stop resisting.
The opening moment is not loud because of what is said. It is loud because of what changes. In that narrow slice of time, the situation crosses a line from negotiation to force, from uncertainty to irrevocable consequence. Everything before it is tension held together by words. Everything after it is gravity. To understand how that shift becomes possible, the story has to begin earlier at the point where authority first hesitates, then fragments, then hardens. This incident unfolds inside an airport jet bridge, a space that exists in a legal and psychological grey zone. It is not a public sidewalk, but it is not fully inside an aircraft. Control is shared, conditional, and poorly understood by almost everyone involved. That ambiguity becomes the fuel for escalation. Airline staff, security personnel, and sworn officers are all present, yet no one owns the situation in a clean, decisive way. Authority is layered rather than unified, and when authority layers compete instead of coordinate, the person at the center absorbs the confusion as pressure. From the earliest moments, the woman is framed not as a customer with a dispute, but as a problem to be moved. The language used around her focuses on clearing the jet bridge, keeping schedules intact, and avoiding delays. That framing matters. Once efficiency becomes the priority, human context becomes an obstacle. Her distress is acknowledged, but only insofar as it can be managed quickly. She is told that a refund is possible, that the matter can be handled at a counter, that cooperation will prevent things from becoming worse. These are not threats yet, but they are conditional promises. Each one carries an implied warning. Comply now, or lose control later. Legally, the situation is precarious. At this stage, there is no clear crime established. Officers themselves acknowledge that she has not committed a criminal offense, and that law enforcement involvement is, in their words, something they would prefer to avoid. That admission is critical. It means everything that follows is not inevitable. The path toward arrest is being built step by step, not triggered by a single unlawful act. This is how many controversial bodycam cases begin not with a crime, but with a failure to resolve a non-criminal conflict. The woman's position is simple, even if emotionally charged. She believes she was improperly denied boarding, she wants her bag, and she wants to get to her destination. Underneath those demands sits something deeper: fear. She is in a state she does not know, with limited money and no immediate plan for shelter or travel. When she says she does not feel safe, that statement is not treated as information, it is treated as resistance. Instead of triggering a de-escalation response, it is absorbed into the narrative that she is refusing to comply. This is where power dynamics quietly shift. Officers begin explaining consequences rather than solutions. Trespass is introduced not as an active charge, but as a looming possibility. Being banned from the airport is discussed. The language moves from "we can help you" to "this will get worse if you don't." These statements are framed as advice, but functionally they are leverage. The more leverage is applied, the more the woman clings to the only option she believes offers safety. Being taken into custody, her repeated request to go to jail is often misunderstood by viewers as irrational or manipulative. In reality, it reflects a catastrophic narrowing of perceived choices. When someone believes they have no safe place to go, custody can appear, paradoxically, as stability. Jail means shelter, structure, and certainty, however harsh. The tragedy is that this interpretation is never meaningfully engaged by officers. Instead of recognizing the request as a signal of distress, it is treated as defiance. At this point, the interaction becomes a contest over control rather than a problem-solving exercise. Officers insist she leave. She insists she cannot. Each side repeats their position, and repetition replaces dialogue. Importantly, officers still acknowledge that she has not committed a crime. That acknowledgement creates a contradiction. If there is no crime, then the only remaining enforcement mechanism is trespass after warning. Trespass becomes the legal bridge that allows force to be justified, but only if refusal to leave is framed as intentional and unreasonable. This is where discretion matters most. Trespass laws are not automatic triggers. They require judgment. In this case, judgment is influenced by impatience, institutional pressure, and a growing perception that the woman is not listening. Yet listening is not the same as agreeing. The woman hears the instructions. She simply cannot comply without, in her mind, placing herself in danger. That distinction collapses under the weight of enforcement culture, where compliance is often equated with legitimacy. As the standoff continues, emotional intensity rises. The woman's distress becomes more visible. She calls for help, seeks reassurance, and repeatedly explains her lack of resources. None of this alters the officer's trajectory. Once the decision path tilts toward removal, new information no longer changes the outcome. This is a classic escalation pattern. Early flexibility followed by late rigidity. The system appears calm on the surface, but internally it has already chosen its ending. The opening hook clip captures the exact moment when that ending begins. Physical contact replaces verbal negotiation. Commands accelerate. Multiple officers move in simultaneously. In Bodycam analysis, this moment is crucial because it reveals whether force is used as a last resort or as a mechanism to end inconvenience. Here, the transition is abrupt. There is no clear final warning that force is imminent, no explicit countdown, no clear articulation of arrest status before hands are on her. Once physical force begins, the narrative changes instantly. Resistance is declared. That declaration is powerful because it reframes everything retroactively. Movements made in fear or confusion are now interpreted as intentional defiance. Pain responses become evidence of non-compliance. The body becomes the battleground on which legality is decided in real time. The officer's commands during this phase are rapid and overlapping. For a person already overwhelmed, this creates cognitive overload. Compliance requires processing instructions, managing fear, and controlling physical reactions simultaneously. Failure in any one area is read as resistance in all areas. This is how situations spiral. Not because someone intends to fight, but because the environment makes calm compliance nearly impossible. The allegation of biting emerges during this struggle, whether it occurs exactly as perceived or as a reflexive act during restraint, becomes a matter for later courts. In the moment, it serves a different function. It solidifies justification. Battery on an officer transforms the incident from discretionary enforcement into mandatory action. The narrative hardens. This is no longer about a stranded travelite, it's about officer safety. After restraint, the tone shifts again. There is a return to procedural language. Officers check injuries, discuss charges, and prepare transport. The emotional storm recedes, replaced by administrative calm. This contrast is stark. The person who moments ago was pleading for safety is now processed as an offender. Her earlier vulnerability no longer matters. The system has moved on. What makes this case particularly unsettling is not that force was used, but how avoidable the force appears in hindsight. At multiple points, alternative paths existed. Temporary assistance, social services, airline accountability, or simply time could have changed the outcome. Instead, the system defaulted to enforcement because enforcement is what it is built to do. This is not a story about individual cruelty. It is a story about institutional momentum. Each actor operates within their role, following policies, managing risk, and avoiding delays. No single decision seems outrageous on its own. Yet, together, they form a chain that leads inexorably to violence. That is how misuse of authority often manifests not as malice, but as accumulation. The opening hook clip matters because it is the point of no return. Everything before it is negotiable. Everything after it is damage control. By isolating that moment, the documentary forces viewers to confront the precise second when discretion ends and force begins. Not to sensationalize it, but to understand it. In the next part, the analysis will move deeper into the legal thresholds at play, examining how reasonable suspicion, trespass authority, and arrest standards are applied on misapplied controlled spaces like airports. We will trace how institutional incentives shape officer behavior, and how vulnerability is often misread as defiance when systems lack the tools or the patience to respond differently. By the time force is used, the legal framework surrounding the encounter has already been quietly bent into shape. What appears chaotic on the surface is underneath a methodical narrowing of options driven by institutional logic. To understand why this situation ends the way it does, it is necessary to slow the footage down mentally and examine the thresholds that are crossed often without clear acknowledgement long before handcuffs appear. Airports occupy a unique legal environment. Portions are federal property, portions are controlled by private airlines. An enforcement authority overlaps between local police, airport police, and federal regulations. That complexity does not excuse confusion. It heightens the responsibility for clarity. In this case, clarity is missing. Officers openly debate who controls the jet bridge, whether it is airline operated or federally controlled at that moment, and whether the woman can be compelled to move absent a formal trespass order. That uncertainty matters because enforcement power is only legitimate when its source is clear. Early on, officers correctly note that they cannot physically force her to leave unless certain conditions are met. That is an accurate statement of law. Trespass requires notice and refusal. Until then, her presence, however inconvenient, does not automatically justify removal. This acknowledgement shows that the officers understand the legal limits. The problem is not ignorance. It is what happens next. Rather than resolving the underlying issue, her stranded status, her luggage, or her lack of funds through interaction, shifts toward manufacturing compliance. Notice is implied rather than cleanly delivered. Warnings are scattered across conversation rather than clearly stated. Instead of a single, unmistakable instruction followed by time and support to comply, the woman is subjected to a rolling series of conditional threats. If you don't move, this could happen. If that happens, things will be worse. The law becomes a cloud rather than a line. This approach creates a psychological trap. For the officers, it feels reasonable. They are explaining consequences. For the woman, it feels destabilizing. She is not being told what will happen now. She is being told what might happen later. That uncertainty amplifies her fear. When fear rises, rational problem-solving diminishes. This is not speculation, it's well-documented human behavior under stress. The woman's repeated statements about her lack of money and unfamiliarity with the state are not irrelevant details. They are contextual factors that should inform discretion. Policing doctrine emphasizes that discretion exists precisely for situations like this where strict enforcement may technically be permissible but practically harmful. Yet discretion here is increasingly replaced by procedural momentum. Once the idea of trespass is introduced, everything begins orbiting around it. A critical moment occurs when officers emphasize that they do not want to become involved. On the surface, this sounds benevolent. In reality, it frames involvement as punishment rather than assistance. Law enforcement presence becomes a threat rather than a resource. This framing pressures compliance not through lawful command, but through fear of escalation. When the woman responds by requesting jail, the logic collapses. The threat no longer works. Her request to be taken into custody disrupts the officer's leverage. If jail is what she wants, then warning her about jail loses its coercive power. This is where the interaction becomes unstable. The officers are no longer guiding behavior, they are reacting to it. Their authority depends on compliance, and compliance is no longer forthcoming. At this point, the system has two options: reframe the situation with care, or assert control through force. The legal justification for arrest hinges on trespass and later resistance. Trespass, however, is not simply refusal, it is refusal after lawful notice. In emotionally charged environments, notice must be unmistakable. It must be clear, specific, and delivered in a way the person can reasonably understand and act upon. Here, notice is fragmented. It is embedded in conversation, diluted by negotiation, and overshadowed by emotional intensity. That ambiguity becomes crucial later when resistance is alleged. When officers decide to move hands-on, the legal narrative shifts instantly. Resistance does not require intent in the way many assume. It often requires only non-compliance during an arrest. This creates a feedback loop. If a person does not clearly understand they are under arrest, and force is applied, their instinctive reactions can be labeled resistance. Resistance then retroactively justifies the arrest itself. This circular logic is one of the most controversial aspects of modern policing. The Bodycam footage shows commands escalating rapidly once physical contact begins. Multiple officers issue instructions simultaneously. From a training perspective, this is problematic. Clear command presence requires a single voice when possible. Overlapping commands increase confusion, especially for someone already overwhelmed. When compliance does not occur instantly, officers interpret delay as defiance rather than overload. The allegation that the woman bit an officer becomes the fairness linchpin of the case. It transforms the incident from a low-level trespass into a violent felony. Yet even here, context matters. Biting during restraint is often reflexive, particularly when someone feels their face or airways being restricted. This does not excuse the act, but it complicates its interpretation. The law may treat it as battery regardless of intent, but ethical analysis demands more nuance. Importantly, the officer's own language after the struggle reveals tension within their narrative. There are statements suggesting that things did not need to escalate this way, followed by immediate reassertions of authority. This oscillation reflects cognitive dissonance. On one hand, there is recognition that alternative approaches existed. On the other, there is institutional pressure to defend the outcome once force has been used. After the arrest, the woman continues to articulate her central grievance. She asked to be taken to jail because she felt unsafe, and instead she was forcibly taken down. From her perspective, the violence feels gratuitous. From the officer's perspective, it feels justified by resistance. These perspectives are not reconciled because the system does not require reconciliation. It requires charges. The subsequent charging decisions follow a familiar pattern. Trespass establishes initial illegality. Resisting with violence escalates severity. Battery on a law enforcement officer cements the narrative. Disorderly conduct fills any remaining gaps. Each charge reinforces the others, creating a stacked legal framework that is difficult to unwind later. Regardless of how the encounter began, what is often lost in these cases is the role of institutional incentives. Airports prioritize security and efficiency. Airlines prioritize schedules. Police prioritize control and officer safety. None of these priorities are inherently wrong. The problem arises when they align against an individual who lacks power, resources, or support. The system becomes optimized for removal, not resolution. This is where accountability becomes complex. There is no single policy violation that stands out as egregious. Instead, there is a series of small decisions, each defensible in isolation, that collectively produce a harmful outcome. This is why such cases are rarely resolved through discipline alone. The issue is not one bad actor. It is a structure that rewards speed over care. The competency review mentioned at the end of the transcript adds another layer of gravity. It suggests that the woman's mental state may have impaired her ability to navigate the situation. If that is the case, then the system failed at its most basic level, recognizing vulnerability. Modern policing emphasizes crisis intervention training for precisely these scenarios. Yet training only matters if it is applied when it counts. In this incident, vulnerability is consistently misread as obstinacy. Fear is interpreted as refusal. Distress is treated as defiance. Once those interpretations solidify, force becomes not only permissible, but seemingly necessary. This is how systems justify harm without acknowledging it. Part 3. We'll examine the aftermath, how the narrative is finalized through reports, charges, and court proceedings, and how institutional processes often lock in early interpretations. Rather than revisiting them, it will also explore what accountability could look like in cases where harm emerges not from malice, but from momentum. The aftermath of this encounter provides a stark illustration of how authority consolidates its narrative once physical force has been applied. The bodycam footage ends, but the story continues in paperwork, charges, and procedural decisions that carry long-term consequences. In analyzing this phase, it is critical to separate factual documentation from the institutional interpretation of those facts, and to understand how law enforcement systems transform ambiguous interactions into codified outcomes. Immediately following the physical confrontation, officers perform standard procedural steps: checking injuries, securing the individual, and arranging transport. These actions, while routine, are also performative in nature. They demonstrate control to the individual, to any observers, and to the system itself. The performance of procedure carries weight in court and in administrative review. It frames the encounter as lawful, orderly, and professional even when the events leading up to it were chaotic and emotionally charged. Simultaneously, the narrative of compliance versus resistance solidifies. Any movement interpreted as non-compliance is retrospectively classified as resistance. This classification is reinforced through internal communication and official reporting. Once resistance is documented, the legal justification for arrest is retrospectively validated. In other words, the events are read backward. First the charge, then the evidence is aligned to support it. This is not an accusation of falsification. It is a structural phenomenon inherent in how law enforcement translates real-time ambiguity into prosecutable claims. The charges themselves reflect a carefully calibrated hierarchy of enforcement. Trespass and disorderly conduct capture the initial behavioral disruption. Resisting with violence escalates the perceived threat. Battery on a law enforcement officer elevates the incident to a serious criminal matter. Each charge serves a purpose. They codify the event in progressively severe terms, providing the system multiple avenues to assert authority and justify action. By stacking these charges, the legal framework becomes resilient to ambiguity, ensuring that even if one element is contested, others remain enforceable. Equally important is the way the institutional response intersects with mental health considerations. The transcript notes that the case moved into a competency review phase, highlighting the potential influence of psychological state on behavior. Competency evaluations are designed to assess whether an individual can understand the proceedings and participate in their defense. In practice, this evaluation also serves as an acknowledgement that conventional enforcement mechanisms may not adequately account for vulnerability. It is a rare moment where the system recognizes the limitations of its standard procedures. Yet, by the time mental health assessments are considered, the physical and legal consequences of the encounter have already occurred. The opportunity to de-escalate without harm has passed. This raises fundamental questions about procedural justice. Procedural justice emphasizes fairness, transparency, and participation, particularly in enforcement encounters. In this case, while officers followed internal protocols, the individual's perception of fairness and safety was minimized. Her repeated explanations of fear, isolation, and lack of resources were recognized, but not integrated into operational decision-making. This demonstrates the tension between procedural compliance and substantive justice. It is possible to follow the rules while still producing an outcome that is perceived as unjust or harmful by the person affected. The broader institutional implications are significant. Airports and airlines rely on law enforcement as a backstop for operational efficiency. Officers rely on policy, training, and precedent to guide decisions in ambiguous situations. When multiple systems converge on a single individual who lacks social or legal leverage, the result is often a deterministic escalation. Policies designed to maintain safety and order combine with human stress responses to produce a fixed trajectory. This is neither heroic nor villainous, it is systemic. A key lesson emerges in how early decisions shape later outcomes. The moment she is told that trespass is possible, the trajectory begins to harden. The repeated warnings, though well-intentioned from the officer's perspective, start to form a psychological boundary. Step outside it, and consequences follow. Her requests to be taken into custody, interpreted as irrational, could have been engaged differently. A diversion toward assistance rather than coercion might have prevented escalation. In every procedural step, there existed an alternative path that was not taken, illustrating how small judgments accumulate into irreversible outcomes. The physical act of restraint, the use of hands-on force, cannot be separated from its context. It is the crystallization of months, years, and decades of institutional design. Training manuals, standard operating procedures, and legal thresholds converge at that moment. Force is justified by resistance. Resistance is defined by incomprehension. And stress, and incomprehension and stress are products of systemic ambiguity and social vulnerability. The encounter is thus less a story of individual choice than a case study in emergent behavior within structured systems. Once the legal narrative is set, the system's focus shifts to documentation and court processes. Charges are filed, medical checks are recorded, and competency reviews are initiated. Each step solidifies the encounter in bureaucratic memory. Yet the person at the center experiences this very differently. Her narrative fear, confusion, and requests for safety becomes secondary to the institutional account. The dissonance between lived experience and legal documentation is where accountability debates arise. Scholars of policing note that these gaps are where patterns of misuse of authority often persist. Systems may claim adherence to policy while producing outcomes that compromise individual rights or well-being. The competency review phase also highlights a systemic tension: the intersection of mental health and law enforcement. When behavior is later evaluated for potential psychiatric influence, it is often used to explain deviation from expected compliance. This can mitigate perceived culpability in court, but does not retroactively prevent physical harm or distress. During the initial encounter, it underscores the need for preventive integration of mental health expertise in real-time operational settings. Rather than as post hoc justification or evaluation, from a policy perspective, this incident demonstrates the limits of standard enforcement in situations involving vulnerability. Standard procedures prioritize control, liability avoidance, and procedural correctness. They rarely account for the psychological states or financial constraints of civilians in crisis. When those human factors collide with rigid enforcement thresholds, harm becomes predictable. This predictability is not inevitable, it is contingent upon how discretion is exercised, how communication is structured, and how early interventions are applied. Understanding these contingencies is critical for reform efforts. Finally, the story ends with a frozen procedural limbo. Charges are filed, competency evaluations proceed, and the individual waits in legal limbo. Meanwhile, the initial physical and emotional experience persists as a lived reality. The gap between institutional closure, charges filed, reports completed, and personal closure trauma financial insecurity, and disruption exposes the enduring human cost of encounters that prioritize system stability over individual well-being. Conclusion. This case illustrates the complex choreography between law, policy, human behavior, and institutional incentives. It demonstrates how early ambiguity, fear, and systemic momentum converge into irreversible escalation. It highlights the importance of clear legal authority, structured communication, and mental health awareness in enforcement encounters. It exposes the ways that repeated small decisions, each defensible in isolation, aggregate into outcomes that are legally justified but ethically fraught. And it underscores the need for ongoing reflection, training, and structural reform to prevent similar sequences of events from becoming normalized in policing culture. Through detailed analysis of bodycam footage, narrative sequence, and procedural aftermath, the incident offers lessons for law enforcement, legal scholars, and the public alike. It is a microcosm of how authority operates under pressure, how institutional design shapes individual experience, and how accountability is both enacted and deferred in modern policing environments. The story, frozen in those critical minutes and hours, provides a case study in the interplay between law, power, vulnerability, and systemic momentum, a narrative that is as much about the structure of authority as it is about the people it touches.